Okay, let's get started. Before we can build a fully fledged M&A model, we need to understand some context. We need to understand the industry. Broadly speaking, when you're talking about mergers and acquisitions, you have the buyer and the seller. First, within these organizations, you have the business development teams, which are tasked with determining which acquisitions make sense internally, defining strategy around potential acquisitions and partnerships. Then you actually have the management and the board of directors. And so these are the folks that are actually going to bring about and approve acquisitions. And lastly, you have the shareholders, which for deals of a certain size from a buyer's perspective require approval, and almost certainly from the seller's perspective, you're going to need shareholder approval. So those are, broadly speaking, the major groups that are involved in the M&A process within both buyer and seller organizations. There's also, of course, the functional groups, which are impacted by an acquisition, but these three groups, the business development folks, management and board, and the shareholders, are really the ones that are actively involved in the acquisition from the get-go. On the other side of that, you have the supporting players, the investment bankers, and you have accounting, tax, and legal services. And lastly, when relevant, there's the regulators. So when you're talking about public deals, you're going to have to comply with various types of disclosure requirements, regulatory requirements. There's also antitrust issues for certain deals. In terms of our course, as you probably imagine, the focus is going to be on the investment banking product, the actual technical analysis that underlies the M&A process. And obviously, you can't really disconnect the buyer and the seller from that process. So when you sort of think about the focus of this course, it's really predominantly on the buyer and the seller perspectives, the analysis that they have to go through as facilitated by the investment bank. The investment bank serves a very important role in M&A. Specifically, the investment bank provides advice on things like the optimal term and structure of a deal. It provides access to capital, or at the very least facilitates access to capital. And it also helps in many circumstances in actually finding buyers and sellers and even helping to negotiate the correct terms on behalf of either the buyer or the seller, depending on who the client is. Now, perhaps the three most common types of IB engagements, so from the perspective of the investment bank, the most common types of engagements are buy-side engagements, where your work is predominantly advising the buyer. There are sell-side engagements, where you're predominantly advising the seller. And lastly, there are fairness opinions. Fairness opinions are supposed to be an independent opinion that speaks to the fairness of a deal. And it's a document that has a lot of the technical analysis that we're about to go through, and it's something that's provided to the board, presented to shareholders. It says this is something, this is a deal that we think is fair. So one of the things to keep in mind in terms of the investment banking perspective is that work associated with potentially winning M&A business often begins long before the deal is actually in play, that the management teams on both sides have actually committed to doing a deal. And so through that process, and even before that process, investment banks are often pitching M&A ideas to both potential buyers and sellers. And so if you sort of think about what is the role of different professionals within the investment banking groups, well, the senior bankers are basically trying to win business. They're trying to bring business in. They're trying to cultivate relationships with management teams, trying to understand what the management teams are thinking, potential buyers and sellers, so that they can ultimately provide strategic advice that's going to be relevant to the buyers and sellers. So they're cultivating relationships, trying to win business. The junior bankers are mostly tasked with doing the grunt work, the actual nuts and bolts analysis. And that represents the crux of what we're trying to do here, which is we're going to walk you through how to actually build the analysis. You can sort of broadly look at that as being comprised of two components. One are the pitch books that are the sort of the presentation that the senior bankers are going to make, assuming that they can get the meeting to sort of pitch a certain idea or a strategic alternative. The modeling, what we're going to go through, is the underlying analysis that then gets summarized and pasted into these typically PowerPoint pitch books. And this is a pitch book by Catalyst Partners, Frank Quattrone's company. And so we can take a look at what an actual pitch book represents, and let's look at that really quickly before diving into other stuff. Okay, so here we have the pitch book, and this is a pitch that was made by Catalyst Partners on behalf of Autonomy. And they were specifically trying to get Oracle to buy this company. So this was a sell-side engagement that talks about why autonomy is great and why it would make a good candidate for Oracle. So if you look, this was presented several years ago. It has information about autonomy. It has its general financial performance, its trading overview. You can see various charts, and this is fairly representative of what you'd see in a pitch book, what historical figures look like. And then there's some market information, some of the things that autonomy does well. And so you see comps analyses here. Those of you that have already gone through our comps training, pretty comfortable with sort of the general idea, the analysis that goes into this to arrive at these multiples to show that, for example, autonomy is actually properly valued or valued attractively. Here's autonomy. The other, sort of the second piece of that pitch book has sort of more financial information. This is what's called an annotated stock chart, represents a fairly standard slide depicting what's going on from to the stock price, trying to explain why the stock price is moving the way that it does, describing its PE multiples over time. Again, this is a fairly representative pitch book, which also walks through, for example, what is the inside ownership for autonomy and how that's changed over time.